Because all of a sudden it went quiet. So welcome folks, welcome to the last Artists Now Visiting Artists of the semester. So before I introduce our guest, which is my guest tonight, I should say some thank yous to this series. Many of you know that this is a lecture series that's put on by the entire Department of Art and Design, that the decision making comes from the entire faculty, and faculty put forth names, and two faculty members then wrangle all those names and put together the schedule a year in advance. And so huge thank you goes out to Nathaniel Stern and Christine Woywood, who are putting together our next schedule and have been involved in this last one as well. Yevgenia Kaginovich has done a lot for Artists Now for many years. And I know herself and Hans Gingelsberger was part of the committee. So that is a huge thank you as well. If I saw Yev, I'd embarrass her because it's kind of amazing that Yev, she's such a huge supporter of Artists Now. She's the chair of the Art and Design Department. She just won the UWM Distinguished Undergraduate Teaching Award. So it's unbelievable. It's really quite an accomplishment. So if you see Yev, make sure you congratulate her. And also think that if you can't make it to Artists Now all the time, the chair of the department's here for just about every single talk. And many others. Josie Osborne's in the front row as well, who's head of foundation. So a lot of faculty are here, time in and time again, supporting the series because the series is incredibly important. We've seen a lot of great artists all semester long, and we'll see a lot next semester as well. I have a bonus for next week. You probably have noticed that next week we are without a visiting artist, that this is closing out. I actually felt that our class didn't get as many visiting artists as we usually do. So I'm bringing in two guests next week just for my class. So next week my class will see two artists, and everyone in this room is welcome to attend that as well. Pete Rayland is going to present for the first half of the class. Pete is in Just Seeds, the print collective I work in. He's a great printmaker. He just got his MFA from the University of New Mexico, this really interesting public art. And he really came out of DIY punk rock, and he took that ethics of touring around the country and spread it into collective art making practices. He's a great presenter as well. He presented in Josie's class about a month ago, and a very engaging speaker. Our second speaker that night is none other than our TA. Those of you in my class know Neil Suppo's name. You probably have no idea what his work is. He's a painter, a very talented painter. My 3-year-old daughter absolutely adores his work. She goes straight to his work every time she sees it in kennel work. So Neil's going to talk to us about his work. So next week should be great for my class and anyone else who would like to come to hear this lecture. You'll hear Pete talk about printmaking and sculpture and painting and installation, and Neil will talk about painting. So it should really enrich our semester. So look forward to that next week. The other thing I want to tell my class is because the guest tonight is my guest, I'm responsible for hosting, so we won't have a second half of the class after break. So after the question and answer period with Dylan, come up and talk to him, meet him, ask any questions, but then turn in cards to myself and Neil tonight. So we'll end after the Artists Now talk tonight. So look on D2L. You are required to post about the lecture. There will be information about next week. So that's, I guess, the house business to talk about for the class. Let me introduce the guest. I can read you the formal bio, which I will, but I'll just say, first and foremost, Dylan is just a great friend and someone I've wanted to bring here for a long time. Dylan represents a lot of what contemporary art practice is today, which is completely interdisciplinary. He's got an individual art practice, which he'll showcase tonight. He's got a collective art practice. He works in Just Seeds as well. He has a visual art practice, but he also has an academic practice as well. He has a PhD in art history. So he's all over the board. which is, I think, really indicative of how I teach and how I see the contemporary art world is. That was my main reason for bringing him here tonight, besides the fact that his art and his writing is really extraordinary. So, Dylan Miner is an artist, art historian, activist, who focuses on indigenous and anti-colonial issues. Miner is from Michigan and is of Métis descent. He has mixed heritage, half native, half French-Canadian. Am I correct with that? In 2012, he exhibited at the Dreaming Australia International Indigenous Festival and hung solo exhibitions at the Small Projects in Norway and Gallery 101 in Ottawa. 2010, he was awarded a prestigious Artist Leadership Fellowship from the National Museum of the American Indian, the Smithsonian in DC. His art has been exhibited extensively across the the United States, Canada, and the world. Additionally, Miner holds a PhD in the history of art from the University of New Mexico. He has published extensively and lectured globally on contemporary art, indigenous visual sovereignty issues, and radical politics, and has 2 forthcoming books from the University of Arizona Press and the Press IB Taurus. To date, he has published more than 40 journal articles, book chapters, review essays, and encyclopedia entries. Miner is an associate professor in the residential college in the arts and humanities at Michigan State University, and he coordinates the Michigan Native Arts Initiative and is curator of the Indigenous art at the Michigan State University Museum. Without further ado, Dylan Miner.
How's that? Is that fine? Can you hear me? Yep. So thanks, Nicholas, for bringing me out, and thank you all for being here. I know some of you, it's your class time, so you can have to be here, but everyone outside of that who came on their own volition, thanks for coming and attending my lecture. As you can see, the title of my lecture is History, Memory, and Anti-Colonial Collaboration. So I'll be walking through some of my artistic practices this evening, thinking about the intersection of art activism and being in the contemporary world. I, as Nicholas said, am a Métis artist. The Métis people historically were in this region around the Great Lakes, but primarily in Ontario and in Western Canada, kind of at the US-Canada borderlands. And so one of the things that I've been taught is that when you travel, you should always recognize the traditional owners of that territory, the Indigenous peoples of that land. And so I think it's all important for you to do as well, is that when you travel around the US, when you travel around North America, even when you head to Australia, New Zealand, other parts of the world, right, to recognize who was on that land before it became settler colonized. And so here in Wisconsin, of course, we're in traditional Oneida, Menominee, Anishinaabe, Meskwaki, Sauk, and even Métis territories, as well as some other folks that came down through this territory. And so it's important to recognize that this land was once, still is, and will forever be Indigenous land. Another thing that I've been taught and have learned to do is to present yourself, to tell you a little bit about who I am and where I come from. I didn't grow up speaking Michif, which is the main Métis language, but I've learned enough of it to introduce myself, and so I'll do that. Je suis Métis, nimishun tepuash Michif, nimishun tepuash Otmesiwa, Jupenotan Penedangashi, Drummond Island, Red River, Slave Lake, tous les enfants d'Ayawawak, Minaka Popamite, Marseille. So what I said was, I told you a little bit about who I am and where my family comes from. Excuse me. Basically, I told you where my family comes from 4 different historic Métis communities in Michigan, in Ontario, in Alberta, and in Manitoba, so on both sides of the US-Canada border. And unlike many other Indigenous peoples who have clan systems, and you can tell who people are, who they're related to and connected to through the clan system. Métis peoples have basically familial lines, and you can kind of tell who someone is based on who they're related to. And so I descend from the Minor, Brissette, and Larondo families, as well as the Kennedy family, which are all different Métis families. What I want to focus on tonight is thinking about the role that art plays in engaging with contemporary activist movements. As Nicholas said, I work with Just Seeds. My artistic practice emerged initially as a way of thinking through political issues, as a way of engaging with social justice and social movements. But I also want to think about the way that I transitioned from being primarily a printmaker into doing these collaborations. Doing collaborations with community, and primarily with Indigenous communities in Michigan, in communities around where I live, but also throughout the world. I've worked with communities, Indigenous communities in Australia, in Norway, in Mexico, in the US, various parts of the US, in Canada. And so in these collaborations, a lot of different things emerge. I wanted to start with this image here. Sorry, I think I need to move the mic. I wanted to start with this image here because this was the image that was actually on the flyer. And this is the image that announced my trip here. And this is a project from 3 years ago called A Bundle of Twigs. And as I said, I worked primarily or initially as a printmaker, and this was a series of prints I did for a solo exhibition in Cleveland, in which I wanted to engage sport. Much of my work investigates sports and the relationship between sports and masculinity, sports and nationhood, sports and identity. Sports as a way of bringing in people who otherwise wouldn't engage in the visual arts. And with this project, I took 2 series of bats, 18 bats, 9 on each team, and carved them based on various professional baseball players. The show was called, the subtitle of it was Indians versus Immigrants. So as we all know, Cleveland, the professional baseball team in Cleveland are the Cleveland Indians. For some time, Indigenous peoples, Native peoples have been advocating and arguing that Indigenous folks shouldn't be used as mascots for sports. Yet, if we look at professional sports, we look at high school sports, we look at collegiate sports, there's remain teams who still use kind of racist nomenclature and imagery to kind of name themselves. So when in Cleveland, I wanted to evoke the idea of sports and this notion of kind of the Cleveland Indians to engage with conversations about immigration and conversations about indigeneity, about kind of the notion of being indigenous to a certain place. So what I did was created 9 bats, which were all Native American professional baseball players, real figures, as well as another series of 9 bats that were all carved based on Latino or immigrant professional baseball players. And the idea was to provoke or to start to think about the relationship between sport and the way that something such as America's pastime can be such a kind of is an environment that's so, at this moment, so heavily Latino, yet still is America's pastime. It becomes that space to engage and to converse about different sides, right? And sport is important, I think, too, because when you support a sports team, right, you kind of do it and you become a fan and you kind of say, I am on this side or that side. And so what I was asking people to do in some ways, through the guise of historical and archival research, unearthing these figures who played professional sport, I began to think about the relationship here. If you look at the title here, some of the slides will have the titles of the work, some will not. But the title of this project, the actual title is called A Bundle of Twigs. And another thinking that was happening with this is that the project happened in 2010. 2012 was the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812. If If anyone knows your local history, your regional history, the War of 1812 led to the Treaty of Ghent and the kind of solidification of the border between the US and Canada. But Tecumseh's rebellion was the kind of indigenous uprising resistance that then kind of led into the War of 1812. And this idea of a bundle of twigs comes from a quote that's attributed to Tecumseh. Tecumseh said that a bundle of twigs is weak. And individual twigs are weak, yet a bundle of twigs are strong. Thinking about kind of we as individuals kind of don't have power alone, but collectively and in solidarity, we have some sort of voice and some sort of power. So, as we'll see in a little bit, much of my other work investigates kind of solidarity issues, union issues, working class issues, and so with a bundle of twigs, Indians versus immigrants, the baseball bats themselves became the twigs, which then began to replicate and began to speak to issues of solidarity and issues of local history. So much of my work is about history. I'm interested in excavating oftentimes marginalized stories. I'm interested in engaging in conversations and oral histories with individuals. For about a year and a half, with two friends of mine, I coordinated something called the Nikwejong Oral History Project, where we met weekly with Ojibwe elders who were retired from the auto plant and had kind of looked at and discussed with them the history of Native auto workers in Michigan. And so I'm very interested in engaging in history as a way to spark the image and as a way to use the art to communicate. These are two recent projects. I'm going to set these up and then I'm going to kind of go backwards and move forward again. So Nicholas mentioned that I work with him in Just Seeds. The image on the left, and when it's projected, it's so large. It's about 11-inch print. It's a small print. But Just Seeds recently produced a portfolio dealing with immigration issues. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to connect the dots and show how kind of indigenous Native American sovereignty, ability to self-govern themselves, ourselves, is in fact tied to immigrant rights and the rights of kind of migrants in this country. And so here I made this poster, which in the background, kind of the eagle on the nopal, kind of if anyone knows kind of Latin American history, that is the image that's on the Mexican flag, but it comes to us through Mexica or Nahua cosmology, which is the story given down from Huitzilopochtli when the Aztecs moved from, the Mexica moved from what they refer to as Aztlan, the land of seven caves. When they moved out of Aztlan into what is now Mexico, they were given the prophetic advice that they would know where to build their great city when they saw an eagle perched on a nopal cactus eating a serpent. And so that kind of comes to the Mexican flag contemporarily via that story. And on the other side, we have the turtle, which in the Great Lakes, many indigenous peoples talk about the story of the landmass that is North America, and particularly this part of the world, is in fact Turtle Island. That there's a story of a great flood, and then putting earth, mud on the back of a turtle and land created from that. So what I'm doing here is connecting up these various legacies and these different stories. And so much of my work, visually if not always intellectually, connects disparate relationships and disparate stories. Sometimes it's only in my head, other times I think the relationships are much more clear. And the image on the right is just a project I've been doing right now, working with other Métis artists, primarily in Canada, putting together a series of posters. Okay. So part of my work, engaging in history and memory, has to do with familial memory. Right, I presented myself and told you who I am and where my family comes from. So family memory is important to me. But I also see the arts as having a therapeutic and decolonizing and radical orientation, in that through artistic practice, we can do a variety of different things. And much of my thinking on this comes from two individuals. I've read extensively the work of Frantz Fanon, the kind of Martinique-born Algerian freedom fighter. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Frantz Fanon, and The Wretched of the Earth is one of my favorite works of his. But in addition to Frantz Fanon and other writers of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, anti-colonial writers, Louis Riel is another one who's made some kind of very important statements and written some poetry that I find quite influential. Louis Riel was a Métis guy born in Red River, which is today Winnipeg, Manitoba, and grew up there. During the 19th century, Winnipeg was what was called Red River, was a town of 12,000 people. Over 10,000 of them were Métis. So people of primarily Cree and Ojibwe, as well as English and French descent, speaking the Michif language as well as French. And Riel kind of came to prominence in the 1869 and the 1885 when the Canadian government was pushing west. We can think about what was happening in this country at that time, right? We had Manifest Destiny was happening, railroad roads were being built into the west. In New Mexico, for instance, where I've also lived, the railroad was coming in, and with that you had the influx of lots of money, lots of white settlers, new populations, and with that, people who had been living on their land, their traditional lands for centuries or from the beginning of time, if you use their own kind of creation stories, were being kind of pushed off the land. So in Western Canada, this was happening, and Anglophone Orangemen, Anglophone Canadians were moving west. There's a long history of this sort of movement happening. But in 1860, many of the Métis peoples around Red River were basically being forced from their land. And so what Riel and some other folks did is they created their own, what they called a provisional government, their own temporary government, which they saw as kind of ruling themselves. Of course, the government, the Canadian government, didn't like it, sent military forces, and through kind of violent clashes, Riel went into Montana in exile. Before 15 years later, another figure who I'll show in a second, Gabriel Dumont, went down to pick him up to continue fighting. And from these struggles in the 1800s, late 1800s, the province of Manitoba became one of the newer provinces. And this is important today, and I'll get back to this. This is all important today. All of this historical nonsense, if you will, has importance today, and it's playing out on a daily basis. So I'm not just engaging with history because I'm interested and because I'm a history buff, but in fact, much of this historical information is playing out today in things such as the Idle No More movement, which I'll come back to in a second, as well as the Canadian Supreme Court recently just ruled that the government had insufficiently met its duty to supply 1.4 million acres of land to the Métis and their kids. And so now, in the year 2013, the Supreme Court just ruled that the government is in some way owes Métis peoples for 1.4 million acres of land, which is, in many ways, a shitload of land. But Riel, the guy here sitting in the middle, that's the provisional government. On the eve of his assassination, he was hanged for treason. Although when he escaped to exile in the U.S., he gained U.S. citizenship. So it's interesting being hanged for treason in a country you're not a citizen. Possibly something that can happen. But on the eve of his state-sanctioned assassination, he said this quote. He said, "My people will sleep for 100 years, but when they awaken, it will be the artists who give them back their spirit." Within this kind of beautiful quote, it's almost kind of this prophetic speaking, because he was hanged in 1885. Métis peoples gained kind of status as a unique Indigenous population in Canada. There are 3 Indigenous groups. There are the Inuit, There are First Nations or Native American peoples, and then there are the Métis. And so literally 100 years later, through the work of artists and activists, changes were happening. This is an image of Gabriel Dumont, who went to Montana from Saskatchewan to get Louis Riel and bring him back to fight. Now, I'm showing you these because one, the images on the left are 3 works of mine, 2 prints and a painting with wax. But I have a variety of other works that reference Dumont. But I want you to pay attention to the image on the left because it says Otipemisiwak, and then below it says without bosses. For the Cree people, one of the words that they used to talk about us as Métis peoples was this notion of Otipemisiwak or Otipemisiwak, which, depending on the variation, translates something to the effect as the people without bosses or the people without leaders. Now, as an artist and activist, this is something that I kind of take to heart in how I work, right? What they were referring to was the absence of a traditional kind of chief structure, and the way that during buffalo hunts, right, this egalitarian structure was used for self-governance. Now, I take that notion of being without bosses quite literally. I've been involved in various grassroots activism, anarchist-oriented practices, been involved in labor unions. And then these are 2 images of the Idle No More movement. How many of you in here are familiar with Idle No More? Is that at least kind of trickled down in terms of attention grabbing here in Wisconsin? Well, in November of last year, 4 women in Saskatchewan, right? These are all places you may not be familiar with. Of course, Saskatchewan is a prairie province. And if you go above Minnesota, you have Manitoba, and then go west, you have Saskatchewan, and then you have Alberta, and you go to British Columbia. But 4 women, 3 Native women, and 1 non-Native woman in Saskatchewan said, kind of in response to what Prime Minister Stephen Harper and other officials were doing to Indigenous sovereignty as well as to ecological sustainability, with things such as the Keystone XL pipeline and the Alberta tar sands, the development and use of the tar sands. They said, we as Native people will be idle no more. And from that kind of just initial response to what at the time was a bill that was going through the Canadian government, kind of, these sparks got set off around the world. They've been happening in Michigan, they've been happening here in Wisconsin, they've been happening throughout Canada. I've seen images of them in Mexico. Some friends of mine, some Sami friends of mine in northern Norway have engaged in these activities. And basically what they are is these various nodes of activism using different forms. And what form they've taken in this region, in North America, is the form of the round dance. Is anyone familiar with the round dance? A round dance is a traditional Indigenous social dance emerged out of the plains and prairies, but is also kind of central here in the Great Lakes. And basically, it's a winter and early spring kind of counterpart to the powwow. And what it is you can see the picture up here in the top corner. You can see me in the foreground. Basically, a bunch of people with hand drums singing songs, and then people kind of socializing around them, dancing in circles around them. And what the Idle No More movement did was it took the round dance, this social dance, into kind of privately owned malls and had flash mobs of various durations of time. So you had Indigenous peoples resisting and kind of disagreeing with the direction of politics, kind of creating flash mobs in kind of privately owned public spaces, malls, and then kind of having them for short durations of time and then dispersing. And so what you saw were these nodes all around the world of these moments happening. And it became, in some ways, a very radical and important moment. And this happened kind of throughout this past winter. It has died down to some extent But these issues are still at the forefront. And here you can see the image in the top right, the small hand drum, the round dance, that's at a mall in suburban Detroit. And the one in the front, that is actually on the Canadian side of the border outside of the Ambassador Bridge, which is the most used international border crossing in the world. The bridge between Detroit and Windsor. And you can see here, that kind of intersection is being blocked. Okay. I'll just show this for a second. So I come also from a line of artists. This is my great-grandmother's octopus bag. That's her in the bottom corner there. And this is called an octopus bag. It's basically a shoulder bag, and it's called an octopus bag because you have these 4 dangling sections on each one. There's 2 smaller sections, so you have 8 dangles hanging on it. And this is a beaded bag, not quite as large as you see it here on the screen, having a traditional floral beadwork pattern. Okay. So my first kind of foray into art making was making work in relationship to working class issues. Like Pete Raylan, as Nicholas was saying earlier, I too kind of came of age in punk rock and do-it-yourself zine culture, and became interested in printmaking through that way. But here are this is a poster I did for a project that Josh McPhee organizes called Celebrate People's History. And the image on this is an image of Roscoe Van Zandt, who's one of the black auto workers involved in the Flint sit-down strike. So many of you may be familiar with the Flint sit-down strike, but basically in 1936 and 37, at an auto plant in Flint, Michigan, where my parents lived, a bunch of workers sat down and began to occupy, right, using the parlance of the Occupy movement, occupy the workspace. And what happened was this movement, this moment, transformed the face of labor activism and of the world around. Because workers took over the space, held it momentarily, right? I mean, the strike went for a duration of months in the winter of 36 and 37. And labor historians talk about the importance of this, but it's always discussed as a very white and very male action. And so what I wanted to do was pull out and look at and investigate some of the other figures that were involved in this. And so this is Roscoe Van Zandt, possibly the only black worker who remained inside during the occupation. The image on the other side is actually my mom and sister on the picket line when my sister was a kid, when my dad was striking as a public school teacher before public school teachers were not allowed to strike. So another one of my relief prints. This one has gotten quite a bit of kind of internet and Twitter usage. This is a small relief print that I made actually for Day of the Dead about 5 or 6 years ago. These are all, much of my early work were relief prints. Early work is kind of, much of the work around 5 to 10 years ago, I guess, were relief prints on relief prints from found objects or from reused and recycled and reclaimed objects, oftentimes printed onto paper bags. And this was before people would use hemp or cotton bags, or even, I was doing this even before plastic bags became kind of an option. And this image, just kind of a very rough, raw cutting of the block, looking at the politics of a store like Walmart. And much of this work, this working in this style, kind of comes to me from various different printmaking traditions around the world. If you've studied your art history, and part of the reason I went to graduate school to study art history versus studio art was because I wanted to understand the larger history of the art world, what other artists were making in different places and at different times, what was happening throughout the world, and as a way of influencing and inflecting my own work. So one of the most influential and important artists for me was an artist who was born here in Wisconsin and spent most of his adult life in Chicago, passed away a number of years ago, Carlos Cortez. And this is kind of a portrait of him in the style of papel picado. So Carlos was a labor activist, a Chicano activist, a Mexican-American activist, who was very involved in the industrial workers of the world, as well as producing art. And he was always saying that, do you want to make art for a living, make a living out of art, or do you want to make art in your life? Thinking about the politics and economics of whether or not you make kind of fancy, expensive art to sell, or rather it becomes a central component of your everyday quotidian existence. And of course, Carlos worked odd factory jobs and kind of other sorts of manual labor positions his whole life so that he could write poetry and create art. And these were, I don't have an installation view of that, but those are in a series of about 20 each and often hung kind of in spaces as if they are papel picado or cut Mexican kind of cut paper style of the Day of the Dead tradition. So we can trace this kind of working class or kind of this use of relief prints with labor unions and other institutions. Of course, if you studied our history, the Taller de Gráfica Popular, the TGP, the People's Print Workshop in Mexico throughout the 30s and 40s was very influential. In the IWW, in the Industrial Workers of the World, there was Carlos making work, and then there was another artist who signed his work, X13. And he produced, I've done some archival research, there's not much written about him, many people know his work, but he would produce very raw relief prints, oftentimes very kind of provocative, oftentimes kind of leading you in a certain way, and then would be published in kind of union publications. This is an installation I did at a gallery in Chicago called IWW Memorial Radio. So what I did with this is I uncovered a series of transcripts from IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, radio broadcasts from Detroit in the 1910s. And the IWW was a progressive labor union. They were one of the first labor unions to allow women, to allow workers of color, to allow immigrant workers in this country. And they were during the Palmer raids and during the Red Scare, the House on Activities Committee, House Un-American Activities Committee, were basically not destroyed, but their offices were ransacked and many things happened to them. Your professor's writing a book on social justice, and I think some of this will probably play itself out in that text. But I uncovered a series of these transcripts, and so what I did is I reproduced the radio transcripts in this audio work, and you can see I also have the transcripts, handwritten transcripts, on the wall, as well as a series of zines that I produced from the production of the transcripts and then drawings from those. So having come up in punk rock culture, of course I like to make zines, and so zine making and kind of do-it-yourself publications are central to my working body as well. Here in the middle you can see the tape recorder and the microphone. So central to this was allowing people to also re-record in their own voice, with their own cadence, with their own style, these transcripts, or record any other information they want to. So part of what I like to do is create spaces and then let the situation develop. This is part of that installation as well. It was called From the Shell of the Old. You can see the pennants. Much of my work incorporates using pennants. Like many boys probably growing up in the late 70s and 80s, I had Detroit Tigers pennants in my room. Sorry, Brewers fans, but I had Detroit Tigers pennants in my room. And as I started to realize the history of the pennant is that they've become kind one-dimensional in that we only use them for sports, or sometimes universities will occasionally use them, but they always have that kind of relationship to sport. Throughout much of the early 20th century, various kind of social organizations would use them, working class, fraternal organizations would use them. So I wanted to think about different ways of evoking and reapplying and using the pennant in its many kind of open-ended meanings. And so much of my work you'll see in my installation uses the pennant. I often use the pennant and incorporate non-English language words, especially Indigenous, Michif, Anishinaabe, Mwin, the Ojibwe language, various languages into them. And so this is, here you can just see the installation, some of the relief prints in the background. There's a series of probably 20 different relief prints on paper bags. In the foreground of the top image, it's a video piece that combines an early automotive industry kind of propaganda film mixed with Michael Moore's Roger and Me as a way of kind of thinking about the two sides of this conversation or the absence of a conversation. And at the bottom we have this, and you might be familiar with this area. You can kind of see it here. It's a map of this side of Lake Michigan, right? And so on the bottom image, you can see these cardboard structures that are in and around Chicago. And if you look at the tables at the top, you can see it comes up the Wisconsin shoreline. And what the idea here was that people would mark and start to put flags in these sites of different important historical events and situations, uprisings, resistances, conversations, etc. And you can see on the bottom there's one felt flag right there in the middle of the city. Sorry. Okay. So much of my more recent work, and I said that I would be talking about collaboration, much of my more recent work has been engaged in this, the process of making bicycles primarily with urban Indigenous youth. So urban Native American youth. Working with them to produce bicycles based on traditional knowledge. So I've done this on many instances. I've done it in workshops throughout Michigan, in Ontario, in Vancouver, in Colorado. I'll be heading to Windsor, just across the border from Detroit, in a few weeks to build 15 new bikes with youth. And so what this is, it's using the language of someone like Pablo Elguera. Are you familiar with, have you talked about him in this class or others? No? Well, over the last 15, 20 years, there's been a transition in contemporary art. And I'll actually say this exact same thing in a video I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you a 17-minute video. But in the 1990s, a French thinker, Nicolas Bourriaud, started talking about relational aesthetics. In the 2000s, his ideas were kind of transformed and developed by an artist in Portland, Harold Fletcher, who began to call this type of artwork social practice. And then a few years ago, the Mexican-born, New York City-based artist Pablo Elguera wrote a book called Socially Engaged Art. And what these three different perspectives do is they discuss and think about the way that contemporary art is moved away from the object, where artworks aren't in the thing anymore. And of course, avant-garde artists have been doing this for some time. But art isn't in the thing anymore. It's actually in that collaboration, in that moment of working together, right? And so we can call it socially engaged art, we can call it social practice, we can call it relational aesthetics. Whatever we want to call that, there's this movement that's been going on for some time. And so my work interacts with this, although it doesn't simply replicate it, interacts with these conversations and these ideas by working with urban Native youth to think about a variety of issues. So this is a project called Anishinaabe Bensab Pimskoweb Shigewa, which means Native youth or Native kids ride bikes. So it evokes the bicycle for a variety of reasons. We can maybe at the end talk about why I would employ the bicycle, why we would use the bicycle. But it uses the bicycle as the vehicle literally and metaphorically. To have youth collaborate with elders, to have youth have conversations with young adults, to have a space where we make things that are both based on urban hip-hop culture, especially Chicano or Mexican-American culture, as well as conversations with elders. And this right here, you can see 4 of the bikes that I've made, or you get 4 images, but 7 of the bikes that were made based on the 7 sacred grandfather teachings. So this project was funded by the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, and I worked with urban, primarily Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, so Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi kids in Lansing, Michigan. Collaborated with an organization called the Indigenous Youth Empowerment Program, as well as the Lansing Eastern High School Native American Club. And we made these bicycles, brought in fluent-speaking Ojibwe elders to teach them these ideas. So in Anishinaabe culture, there's the idea, these ideas of the 7 grandfathers. And so we put together 7 bikes, with each of the bikes being a manifestation of one of those grandfathers. Let me show you the actual film, because this I think describes it better than I can.
Jimmy Butch Kuchendero, Kena Yedel Damija, and the one cutting Kishka, cases keeping after. Jimmy Butch Kimuja, Mama Santa Maxwell, with a push Mama Sugarman, go ahead and just say.
So I'm Dylan, I'm the artist on this project. I also teach here at Michigan State University. And so a few years ago I started thinking about the connections between contemporary urban Native youth. Many kids grow up in hip hop. You can see I'm standing here in front of a graffiti piece. But many urban Native kids grow up in hip hop, right? And so for me, it made sense, the connection between Chicano lowrider culture and urban Native kids into hip hop.
This is going to be a little difficult, so stay with me.
Here in Lansing, we're fortunate to have a big crew of Anishinaabe elders. One of the problems that confronts many of the indigenous communities here in Michigan is language maintenance and the continuation of traditional ways. We're blessed here in Michigan to have a crew of elders primarily from the communities, the reserves on Manitoulin Island.
The grandfather teachings, for example, would be a good way to deal with a community or youth project like that. The reason being that there has to be a drive from family values and community values in order to make a project successful. For the youth to behave and think the same way to make things work. And traditionally, that's how things happen. Each child, youth, was trained by a family member or members or the community, and the child would grow into that, into what you now refer to as the grandfather teachings. These were not set aside as such at one time. There was no name for these things. These were automatically teachings that went on throughout life of a young man or an individual. This is what had to happen in order to make a community work.
In the past 20 or 30 years, there's been a change in contemporary art where things like, it goes by many different names,
socially engaged art, participatory art, names like this, but artists have been working in ways that they collaborate with community partners in a way that the artwork is in the collaboration itself.
Hi, my name is Annalena Green. I'm a junior here at Eastern High School. My name is Chelsea Cooper. I'm a 10th grader.
My name is LaQuan Cannon. I'm just a typical teenage boy.
I'm Jason Millian, and I'm a 9th grader at Eastern High School.
You know, when we first started this project and I hung flyers all over Eastern, people were like, why would the Native American Club be building bicycles?
One of the things that's emerged and it's kind of come up, the elders, have taught me this, is that, in our modern urban life, even for Native peoples, we don't visit anymore. And if there's anything that we can think of as kind of a methodology to this project, the methodology to this artwork, is the methodology of visiting. The elders told me that, right, we used to always just stop by people's houses, and in those occasional, just random conversations, right, you get to know people, new ideas emerge, you just have fun, and people are telling stories, right, and those things have fallen by the wayside. So, by planning a specific time, once a week, to get together, to work on these bikes, to tell stories, to have conversations, for people to all get together, becomes a manifestation of this much older Indigenous way, this Indigenous methodology, which is the methodology of visiting, where visiting becomes the way that we do things, that we can learn from that.
My name is Robin Cole, and I am the advisor for the Lansing Eastern Native American Club. I love working at Eastern High School. Eastern is one of 3 high schools here in the Lansing area. We have about 1,200 students here. In trying to determine what we wanted to do, Dylan had provided several pictures that we could look at, and encourage students to focus on the 7 teachings of the grandfather, and with that, to have each bike represent like love, humility, so on and so forth. And I'm thrilled that we're having this group, that we have something to do every week. Sorry!
These amazing lowriders based on traditional and contemporary Indigenous knowledge.
In the woodshop room.
At Eastern High School.
With the workshop space.
Those are the door that leads straight to the courtyard, which is great.
The atmosphere is like
Nice, friendly.
makes you just want to talk to people.
Native American history is totally underrepresented still in high school, and it's important to understand and learn from the elders these stories that may not necessarily be written. And so without teaching the values, because you're not supposed to in a public school, these kids are already demonstrating that they're willing to do that, which again speaks volumes about that character.
In the beginning, we were like learning about the different types of bikes in the park.
Yeah, I didn't even think that, that was possible to just sew it up and change the seats around and put wood on the bikes. I didn't know you could, put wood on bikes and stuff.
We got to put together the bikes, and then the decorating was exactly how I pretty much pictured it.
Ani enandwian marasiwen Indigenous Wagaraxing Odawa Anishinaabe Makwadoro. My name means basically that I'm a healer of this way of life. Heals the circle is kind of how it roughly translates. My real name, or my English name, or American name, or whatever you call it, is Rosie DeLand. I am Little Traverse Bay Band, Odawa Indian woman, and and I'm a bear clan. We have respect for all that is around us, you know.
I'm one of the 7 grandfathers teachings.
And then we like picked up the parts we wanted. So like it'll go like to what we wanted, and then also have like some Native American culture into it.
Culture and heritage being implemented on these bikes. We're taking something that's like man-made and manufactured, usually in factories, but we're like kind of like going back to like most of our roots, and we're like putting heritage on it. And
Everything that we do pretty much has a meaning to it. I don't know, it's just really nice to see everything put together and where it came from, and just learning about it and stuff.
showing that that it's not forgotten.
There's never an end to that. Because we're always learning, always learning.
If we could teach some of these kids the ways to build a bike, ways to fix a bike, but also integrate within that some of the traditional ways of the elders, the 7 sacred grandfathers, the grandfathers' teachings.
It's trying to bring that respect thing is trying to bring your children up also to follow those ways, to be respectful to everything that's around them, and your grandchildren, when they follow behind, you have to try to teach them that respect.
And putting together the actual bicycles, but also learning different art, learning about different traditions within the Native American community, learning how to sew, all sorts of different ways of expressing oneself.
So we're gonna seal the first part of that.
Okay,
While we were building these bikes, they were also like teaching us some of the culture and stuff, so like our minds could like accept it better because we were doing activities while learning it.
Before this, I had never heard of the 7 grandfathers teachings, like ever. And I come from like the Native American background, so I think it was cool to learn about something like this, especially because like that's where I come from and stuff.
I'm just glad I joined. I'm really glad I joined.
How is it?
Well, I mean, it was 11 jackets and sunglasses and a bushy mustache.
I like that.
No, I built a bike. Yeah, it's just gonna be a good conversation starter.
If I didn't do it at all, I would be bored at home doing nothing. So I guess having something to do and like building more friendships and stuff and meeting new people.
If I wasn't doing the project, I would probably not even come to the Native American Club meetings. I really enjoyed like doing this. Not only taking up time from getting in trouble and all those kinds of things, but you're learning and you're having fun doing it, and you're hanging out with people you wouldn't normally hang out with, and just doing something you can be proud of. I think it's needed so kids can learn and learn about their culture, and not even their culture, but other cultures as well, because a lot of people have lots of misconceptions about things that aren't really true. I'm the president of the Native American Club, and that's what I like to do.
Mandagat vatmani shagnashimi. Nisho sunishom sagi dvat charadik. Joshua naman mi ga beshe, chino na ge den dat mo se kate no ko ne ge. We can no ma di man den nishave mo. Mi naman da pone ga beshe, ke no mo eskini get we na kike ab de chum na den get. No no mat we chum matsi. Mi go kena je mix ekwe ni josse me chomsta. Takže na kalmu atnam, to sin go žek na ge mi go pone go ga čega sa to je čego na kit. We ne je čge na den des na de ne pojče malis. Mi go bež gon go. To va čega ekwe. Matsivo, inaksivo. Ivek je nomu in doneš na mesto čežaže. Nešen da še nakazam na čega deke gokni tem goknava wana čega dek win montogan degena to pešknikčik. We ne može nomu in to čečige ogo. Mi ge nože energy kent mat one not zero. One na kaso ge no neki no magi at koma pitch. Mi ge man do me de kom ne ko mat zero. Mi je na ok man da ni jo se mi šum sa. Not zero.
I'll stop it there. We talked for a little bit about the bike project as well. So here you can see that film documented the project as it transpired. Its first iteration with working once a week for 4 hours a day for 4 months with high school aged youth, and then working over the course of 2 intensive weeks with the elementary and middle school kids, which you see riding it at the end. As a collaboration, it brought together various constituencies. Here you can see Andrew Wildbill, the guy on the left, and then Tyler Fleming, the guy on the right, brought together kind of professional Native artists, college-age Native students, college-age non-Native students, fluent-speaking Ojibwe elders, brought the youth into it. It had all of these different kind of multi-generational components to it, and that's what I think, for me, is the most interesting way to think about my artistic practice, is one that doesn't just kind of collaborate with individuals or engage in social practice, but rather does so in a way that works across multiple generations. These are a series of more recent bikes. These are 4 bikes that I produced in collaboration with artists in Vancouver. These are currently touring Canada as part of an exhibition called Beat Nation. They're at the power plant in Toronto. They'll come down, head west, and then head towards Montreal. But these are a series of 4 bikes based on the 4 different directions. And so I worked with an artist from the Northwest Territories, and she made the white bike. An artist, a Northwest Coast Carver artist, who made the black and red bike that you can see with the beautiful kind of cedar fine line work in the frame. It's got a shield, the fine line shield, and then also, you don't see it in either of these, but the hand drum on the back has similar work. And then the gold bike in the background was made by some Plains artists. So I've done this both working with Native artists as well as in a context of kind of cross-cultural collaboration. These were a series of 3 bikes I put together with university students at Fort Lewis College based on local history. One is based on a Mexican-American organization called the Gorras Blancas, which, similar to Louis Riel and the Métis struggles in the 19th century, the Gorras Blancas, and actually Pete Raylan, the artist who will be here next week, did a poster about the Gorras Blancas for the Celebrate People's History series that I did the Flint sit-down strike. But one of the bikes is about the Gorras Blancas, and the top The bottom bike is about the storage of toxic waste on native lands, and the other one is about an Anglo-American labor union, miners union, the Western Federation of Miners. So part of this was also to get the youth, the university students to work together and to collaborate, to think about local history. Of course, I was also, the show was called Animas Perdidas. Fort Lewis College is in the city of Durango, and Durango is on the Animas River. The Animas River, when the Spanish-speaking settlers moved north, the Animas River, the full name is Rio de las Animas Perdidas, or the River of Lost Souls. So this was a show about excavating and finding those lost souls of history in the region, which include those bicycles as well as this other installation work, slide projections, buckets of coal, buckets of water, and these large felt kind of pin-ups on the wall. Of course, the city of Durango also is home to the Cumbres and Toltec Railroad, which is I think the last or one of the last narrow gauge railroads, but it's a coal-burning train, and kind of, you can see the kind of the soot rain down after it goes by. And this is a project I'm working on called Dismantling the Illegitimate Border, where I'm working with youth on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border in Windsor and Detroit. We're putting together these mobile print. We did this up over the fall and winter. We put together these 2 mobile printing presses, screen printing presses, which were then ridden around neighborhoods as a way of remapping the territory, creating pennants which were based on the directions and based on traditional teachings, and then those pennants were hung in public spaces as a way of reclaiming, remapping, rethinking about public space and what that means to both be a youth, but also be able to reclaim that space. So here you can see the group on the left is the group from Windsor, Ontario. The group on the bottom right is the group from Detroit. And this is what the bikes look like installed. Those are the 300 or so pennants that were printed. The youth printed the pennants, and then I hand sew them, and then there's 8 different images, 4 different colors, 8 different images up there, and then you can see the bikes as well as a series of maps and wall paintings that accompany this as well. So it's about thinking about that border space, the space between nation states. What does that mean for people who have traditionally migrated and moved across the border and are now, for the last 200 years, have been unable to do that? And then in the opening with this group, we printed these posters, which in Anishinaabe and English say Indigenous sovereignty with a speech bubble on the one side, and you flip it over, and it says, again, also in Anishinaabe in English, no borders, with an image of a canoe. It's hard to tell what that image is. Okay, let me take another 5 or so minutes to talk about a few additional projects. So much of my work in the last 3 or so years has been working with youth in communities around the Great Lakes and North America, but I also collaborate. As the very first slide that you saw, I didn't mention it, but that's a collaboration that incorporates my own children in the bush in Australia, in kind of western Queensland. And this is an installation I did last spring in Norway. So in the north of Norway, in the north of Sweden, in the north of Finland, and Russia, of course, there are traditional indigenous Sami peoples, reindeer herding peoples, once known as kind of Laplanders, pejoratively. And what I did a collaboration with Sarah Oskal, who is a Sami poet, and now she's actually a cultural advisor to the Sami Parliament. When I came to this town of Tromsø, and Tromsø has a university. I believe it has the world's northernmost mosque. It's this interesting cosmopolitan city, kind of 200 plus kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. But when I arrived to work on this exhibition and to work with the community, what had happened is that at one point the city had monies from the government to become part of what was called the Sami language area, which meant that the federal government would help create all of the signs in both Norwegian and the Sami language. When a new mayor of Tromsø was elected, he decided that he didn't want to partake and be involved in the Sami language area, even though it wouldn't affect the municipal coffers. He decided to back out of this agreement. So in conversations with some individuals and with Sara, I took lines from her poetry and produced these felt signs, screen printed signs in both the Sami language and English. And one of the things that's interesting about Scandinavia oftentimes is that English becomes the kind of the global language. They call it the international language. It's the lingua franca. And so for them, it made more sense to make these in Sami and English than to even include Norwegian. And I think that was interesting for me as someone living in North America, where English is that dominant language. And what happened over the course of the first evening, this, as you can see, after the opening and then kind of continuing throughout the show, these were taken and then relocated to various places within the city. So they're kind of mobile textiles, soft signage, if you will. You can kind of see some of the English language text. They're all excerpts from poems, so they're supposed to be somewhat ambiguous and not top down, but in the back corner you can see it says hide it in corners, and it was about the hiding of one's kind of Sami identity and trying to assimilate it to Norwegian society. The black text over here says made a criminal on good pasture land, so it's about the appropriation of land. And so each of the images correspond between a Sami language and an English language. Although the yellow don't correspond, the yellow are not Sami and English the same ones, that they're disparate, so if you don't speak one language, you don't understand the other signage, and that's important for me. To play with language and to not think about, to not translate stuff literally. If you notice, the last 2, 3, 4 minutes of the documentary was entirely in Anishinaabe and Wind, and the Smithsonian actually wanted to put subtitles on there, and part of my intention was to leave it that. So if you're not a speaker, you're kind of outside of that conversation. This is an installation. Not a collaboration. This is a recent project that I've been doing that is one of the few non-collaborations I've done, but it looks at the notion of prophecy. Various teachings, Indigenous teachings, and what they may mean for our collective shared future. So I looked at different teachings such as Louis Riel's notion of the artist. I've looked at the lacrosse sticks are in reference to Haudenosaunee or Iroquois teachings about the game of lacrosse, as well as the two-row wampum. So we're coming up on the 200th anniversary of the two-row wampum, which of course was that treaty signing between Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people and settlers. And it's hard to tell in reproduction, but if you look at those lacrosse sticks, the shooting strings, which are the kind of white, thick, fat laces that every lacrosse stick has, the two white lines kind of go throughout all of them, and it replicates the two-row wampum, which was a quahog shell beaded, basically, sash, which was used to show the treaties between different peoples. And so they had kind of two rows of white that moved in parallel. And the notion was that although kind of Indigenous and European societies were living different lives, they were living parallel, and they would never kind of impede or kind of prohibit the other from doing what they do. Of course, we know throughout history this is not the case. I guess I can end on this. I can't remember what my next slide is. This is also part of that show, which is about transportation, about migration stories, much in the way that the bats are about incising the baseball bats and then printing from them. These are incised canoe paddles based on maps of specific territories. So this is about the migration from a certain place to another, as well as the kind of doing away with traditional sustainable forms of transportation. This is my cousin's canoe that was dismantled and put on blocks, just like a car would be in your yard. let me end with that. It's getting kind of 8:20. I can feel the vibe in the room is getting a little tired. So I'll leave it with that so we can have some conversation before you go on your way. Thank you.
As a non-native artist, I always wonder, is there a line between, like, or could you describe what you think the line is between cultural appropriation and, like, due respect to other cultures that aren't your own?
I mean, it's, I think, an internal issue, right? And it's one that I have to engage with as well, because, so this is a collaboration kind of in the bush in rural Queensland and Australia, right? And I'm not from that community. And in the same way, I'm not Sami, so, right? So here, I'm not integrating anything other than linguistic signifiers here. So for me, I'm playing with language and doing it in conversation, in concert with community members. I think that's crucial. I mean, I'll throw the question back at you. I mean, do you think there are obvious things that are appropriation, obvious things that are not?
Well, the really obvious things are like, you know, the corporate stuff, like, what's it called, Urban Outfitters.
Urban Outfitters and having Navajo panties and things like that.
Right. But I find it a lot harder to define the line when I'm making art as a white person.
Yeah, I mean, if you want a kind of hard and fast answer, there's probably not one. I think people know those moments, or maybe not.
Notice a lot of your work seems to be about bringing different cultures together. Why, in the video, did you try to keep them separate by not having subtitles?
It was more kind of playing with language and kind of, I mean, you're right. I mean, if you look at, sometimes I bring together, I mean, that whole project is about bringing the lowrider, which comes from Chicano culture. Some historians trace it to LA, some trace it to Española, New Mexico. You know, so you have that, then you have kind of urban hip hop culture, which of course we know comes from the Bronx and Brooklyn, and then you kind of have this, you know, this other one. I wouldn't say it's somehow keeping them separate at the end. It's recognizing the importance of that language, and that if you subtitle the language, then kind of the fluency and the ability to speak that language is not needed anymore. It's interesting because, so in Lansing, Michigan, we have probably, outside of northern Minnesota, the most number of fluent Anishinaabe speakers. And that's because of the auto industry in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, all of these fluent speakers from Manitoulin Island, I intimate this in the video, moved down to work in the auto industry. And of course, Manitoulin's I believe it's the world's largest freshwater island. And because it's an island, they, over the course of centuries of colonization, maintain fluency. And because of that, there's a lot of learning that the youth can do from those elders. And so I guess I wanted to kind of focus on that in the video and make sure that that kind of rose to the surface. Did you feel alienated in terms of watching it at that moment, or?
Slightly, not that it bothered me. I was just noticed that you had actually mentioned that you wanted to keep it separate so people who didn't speak it wouldn't understand, which I thought was bizarre considering the rest of the video.
I'm curious, how did you get involved with all of this? How did you start to feel passion for all these different cultures and histories? Was it something you were brought up with, or was it something you just decided you were interested in? How did that happen for you, and then how did that carry through into your artwork?
I mean, I grew up building bikes. I grew up building lowrider bikes. I like to ride bikes, so that element's there. I think I showed the image in terms of the kind of the union politics. I grew up in a family that was involved in those things. So I think part of it is kind of reconciling or bringing together some of my own familial and personal experiences into contemporary practices. Obviously, what I've tried to do both with my academic work and my artistic work is try to demonstrate the way that, say, the experiences of Menominee folks in Wisconsin are similar to folks out west or are similar to Sami. And that there's a lot of shared kind of histories of colonization and legacies and ways of responding to that. Is there a moment in terms of my creative practice where that became the dominant way of thinking and working? I don't know. But this is, these are issues and things I've been thinking about since I was young and since I was little. So I guess I did grow up with that then. Whenever it gets quiet, I can do the Bueller. That's a joke that never dies. Right?
With the bike project, you worked with so many different organizations and people. How did you get the ball rolling after you had your idea, and how did you approach all these different groups and the elders and so forth?
The very first time, it was all people I knew. So the 7 bikes in the video, and the video is actually at the University of Iowa Museum of Art right now, and I was there last week speaking about it and working with graduate students. And so the very first time, it was all people I knew. So, like Alphonse and Rosie, those are just people around. My partner, she organizes one of the Native Youth programs, so that was an obvious fit. Some of the other people I knew from around. So I guess, initially it was just members of the community and just kind of saying, hey, I have this crazy idea, does it work, do you want to try it? And I said, sure, we got this time, you want to hang out with these kids and try it? And then since then, I think the thing, kind of logistical issue as well as one time tied to logistical, practical, aesthetic, as well as ethical concerns is how does that work out when, and this kind of goes back to another question, when you're not part of that community, right? And it's when I think about it, don't have any definitive kind of thoughts and responses to. I was asked to come to kind of have a show in Tromsø, and so kind of tied it into political issues that Sami were engaging with there. And I had actually kind of in a weird way run into Sara, who I didn't know, doing a performance at this Indigenous Arts Festival in Australia. So I guess that's how they all work, is some weird relationship and connection I have, and then I go from there. The bikes in Vancouver, I had been in a show in this small museum in southwestern Manitoba called, I can't remember what it's called. It was like 5 different artists, native artists making works about bicycles. And one of the other artists in it was this woman, Tanya Willard, who is a native artist from British Columbia, from Vancouver. And so then, through that relationship, started working out in Vancouver. So I guess I get started with ideas and then kind of going from my networks and relationships, either kind of fictive relationships or existing relationships, and then try to kind of tackle it from there.
When you're doing a project with kids, how do you negotiate? It seems like you had a vision with the bike project in terms of how the bikes would be, to some degree, how they would be decorated, and the kids seem to kind of carry it out. I do projects with kids as well, and quite often they don't do what you want them to, or what you hope they would do. They end up doing, like you're trying to do a project on youth identity or something, and then they end up doing Spider Dog, which they do the project. So I'd like to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think that, especially working with youth, you have to see power, right? It needs to be a moment of power sharing and conversation and dialogue. One of the examples I always give is, so one of the bikes, when I was working with the kind of upper elementary school kids, they turned the frame into this dream catcher. And then I was like, oh shit, a dream catcher? Can we get any kind of more over the top, obvious kind of, you know, stereotypical representation of being Native? But through our conversations, they had just, from the woman in the film, Grandma Rosie, they had just learned to make these and to do some beadwork, and for them it was a really empowering moment, right? That they could apply some of the skills they had just learned a few days before into this. And so me, I had to be like, I had to seed that power in that moment, because instead of me saying, well, aesthetically or in terms of what I think this should be, this is not meeting my expectations, they actually saw it as a very empowering moment. I think in the end it was. And that bike, you know, they used synthetic sinew, which is kind of a thin, kind of a muscly, fake muscle tissue to wrap around it, and they included a cowrie shell in there. And of course, the cowrie shell, the miga shell is creation. What the creation story goes that, you know, the creator blew into the miga shell and the world was created. So they integrated that in there. So they were able to kind of take it in a way that I think was interesting. So for me, it's that, you know, having a conversation about why they're doing it, what else could they do, and thinking about those things. Sometimes it's been successful, and for me, I don't think the bikes are the artwork. You know, I think it's those moments, me sharing, visiting, having conversations, and kind of lasting relationships with the kids, with the elders, with just, you know, friends and peers of mine. That is the artwork. You know, I think the bikes themselves are just the remnants of the artwork. So if I think about it that way, I become less kind of wedded to what I think the final outcome should be. But of course, you know, I can have conversations about what certain elements that I don't think are super rad, and elements that I don't think work. Is now the time when you all don't say anything. If someone has a question, you're gonna give them the evil eye. Is that the thing? I know how it works. Students, we're all the same.
Well, they should feel good because we're not going all the way until
I know.
My question, maybe it's a long question, but I'm kind of curious what the reaction has been from strictly Native communities, how the work's received. And second, can you talk about your shift in location for art? Because in Western art, I'm thinking, there's a handful of art capitals, New York and such, and that's where people look to art. It seems like you're looking everywhere. You create projects, the Native presence is everywhere. And where this work is situated is so off the path from, quote, art worlds. Now, I'd be curious if you could talk about that. Because you're using very familiar contemporary art forms, yet you're placing it anywhere and everywhere throughout the world and in North America. You can talk about that, and also talk about how Native communities have responded to it.
Sure. So you're right. This is existing both within contemporary art worlds, kind of plural, right? I mean, there are various art worlds, right? You're all involved in one here in Milwaukee, right? Here in the Arctic Circle in Norway, there exist contemporary art spaces. Tromsø, this community, has a university, as well as it has the third art academy, which was just the third Norwegian art academy, which was just opened a few years ago. So there are these various global and local art worlds, and I think those are the things that interest me. And so I've never kind of skewed away from either having work that exists in the street, having work that exists in a community center, having work that exists in kind of museums and galleries. And so I like to do things. I like to kind of, have some things to say, want to work on some projects, and find that the least prohibitive of those are the dominant institutions. That they allow the kind of marginal, forgotten, kind of parallel institutions, if you will, allow for the most exciting work. In this country, we don't have as vibrant of an artist-run kind of network. We do have artist-run centers and galleries and artist-run projects, but in many countries of the world, they have whole networks of artist-run centers, artist-run projects that are funded by the state or provincial government as well as the federal government. And they came up kind of with activist artists in the 60s and 70s known as parallel institutions, where there are these kind of radical, different spaces. And now they still exist and have always existed in this country, but they've never been institutionalized, if we want to use that word in the same way. So with the bikes, for instance, right now, like I said, they're at the University of Iowa Museum of Art. So they're at a university art museum. Before that, they got shipped there from a tribal museum in Oregon. Before that, they were at a Great Lakes Folk Festival. Before that, they were at a tribal museum in Michigan. So they're kind of, that's the one thing that's kind of beautiful, I think, about Native Kids Ride Bikes is that they're both accessible as well as kind of open-ended. And so much of, I think the bike project, Native Kids Ride Bike, has actually been more successful in what's called Indian country, in Native communities, than, say, this work here. And so this July and August, I'll be in Santa Fe building a series of bikes as part of Indian Market, which is the biggest Native American art market, kind of global art market. So I'll be there building some of the bikes at the Museum of Contemporary Native Art and the Santa Fe Art Institute. So on the one hand, the Museum of Contemporary Native Art is a space, a contemporary art museum specifically for Indigenous artists. And the Santa Fe Art Institute is a high art kind of gallery and artist residency program and educational center. And it's kind of through both of those. So I've never, I guess my work, I don't eschew any of them, but I really am more interested in spaces like small projects, or doing a collaboration here on the banks of a river by this small community here in Bandy, which was miles and miles from nowhere. Or this was in a small artist-run center in Ottawa, right? Or the show, the work I showed at the very beginning when I was talking about Louis Riel, that was part of an artist-run kind of alternative space in Winnipeg called Urban Shaman. So I don't know if I fully answered your question, Nicholas, but does anyone have any more?
Come meet the artist.
Well, thanks, John.
All the class are going to